First of all, I want to start by making an announcement for next week's seminar, next Friday, December the 6th. Matthew Levitt was supposed to speak about Hamas. He's a scholar at the Washington Institute. He will not be able to make it. The seminar is canceled. He has to go to Europe to attend a trial. So this is actually the last seminar of the semester, and we've distributed the list for speakers and seminars next semester in the spring of '08, and I think the seminar series will be packed with some very important and good scholars. So today it's really an honor and a pleasure to have Shalom Lappin here with us today. As you'll hear in a minute, he's a serious scholar from King's College, University of London. But I think more importantly, in a way, he's been a sane voice in an irrational landscape, academic landscape in the United Kingdom. If you've been following the boycott issue and some of the discourse that's happening in the United Kingdom, I think Shalom has been a sane voice and a prolific writer, I think facing down the irrationality of some of the anti-Semitism and some of the views of Israel in the Middle East. So it's really a pleasure to have him here. Shalom is a professor of linguistics. He received a BA in philosophy at York University in Toronto and his master's and PhD in philosophy from Brandeis University. He taught philosophy at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba and linguistics at the University of Ottawa, where he was the chair of the linguistics department until 1984. And he also taught at Haifa University and Tel Aviv University. He was a research staff member for the natural group of the computer science department at IBM at the T.J. Watson Research Center. He then took up a position at linguistics in the Department of Linguistics at SOAS at the University of London, the School of Oriental and African Studies. And we were speaking yesterday about that experience and his experience of watching in the 80s, in the early 80s and early 90s, well-known today jihadists walking around the university creating and organizing seminars and other events. So it was a hotbed for interesting discourse, which I think brings Shalom to some of the issues on anti-Semitism. He came to the philosophy department at King's College in 1999 and then moved to the computer science department at King's College, where he's the head of the department. He's a prolific writer, mostly in the area of linguistics, and he's written numerous books in that area. And as you'll hear today, he's also very insightful on issues of anti-Semitism. Today, the lecture is entitled "The Green and Pleasant Land, Britain and the Jews."
Thank you for that generous introduction. This is one editorial revision. I'm actually not head of the computer science department at King's. I was head of the natural language processing group, and then moved back to the philosophy department for a variety of reasons. Foremost of them being I seem to be a natural wanderer. Most of you have heard about the boycott movement in Britain, which has made headlines around the world and in the American press, in particular in American academic life, and the American Jews have been exercised about this issue. But I think in general there's not a great deal of familiarity with some of the details of British Jewish life and some of the controversies which have been raging throughout public discourse in Britain over the last 10 to 15 years, if not longer, concerning Israel, Jews, and the Middle East. Last year, 2006, marked the 350th anniversary in Britain of the return of Jews to Britain in general, and England in particular, after their expulsion in 1290 under Edward I. This event was duly celebrated both by the Jewish community and by the non-Jewish community in Britain. And attending the celebrations was a presentation of Jewish life in Britain in the post-Cromwell period, when Jews reestablished themselves as an organized presence in Britain as a community, as a period of linear and accelerating achievement of prosperity and of acceptance. And in general, there's a sort of widespread view, certainly amongst Jews and non-Jews alike in Britain, that Jews have been generously treated, that the community is well integrated, that the history of Jews is one of sanctuary for refugees fleeing persecution as opposed to the rest of Europe, that Britain is very different than the rest of Europe in its attitude towards Jews, that surely there have been incidents of prejudice and outbreaks of intolerance over the years, but that by and large it's much closer to the American experience or the North American experience than it is to the European experience. And there's certainly not a little truth in that view. However, there are also good grounds for challenging many of the optimistic assumptions that underlie this approach, in which Jews and the Jewish community have been at least as instrumental as popular non-Jewish imagination in sustaining. But let me initially read a brief quote from the chief rabbi, our chief rabbi of the United Synagogue in the United Kingdom, which expresses this idea of Britain as a traditionally tolerant place for Jews. And it goes like this. This is a paragraph from an article that he published in the Jewish Telegraph as part of the celebration, a series of events celebrating 350 years of reestablishment of Jewish presence in Britain. It goes like, here's a quote. "The Jews who came here loved Britain. They owed it their freedom to live as Jews without fear. In many cases, they owed it their lives. Perhaps it takes an outsider fully to appreciate how remarkable Britain is. Jews loved its tolerance, its courtesy, its understated yet resolute commitment to liberty and civility. They loved Britain because it was British. It knew who and what it was, the leader of freedom in the modern world, the home of Shakespeare, Newton, the Industrial Revolution, and the mother of parliaments. It had confidence in itself, and because it did so, it did not feel threatened by newcomers. Without that confidence, bad things happen." So what you get here is an image of essentially a tolerant country in which Jews have gradually but very firmly reestablished their presence and integrated themselves. What I want to suggest is, in fact, that this is effectively a misrepresentation of Jewish history in Britain, and that much of what's going on now needs to be understood in terms of a reevaluation of this history in light of very well-known facts which have never been suppressed, but have been readily available and have been well researched by mainstream historians, most of them Anglo-Jewish historians, and published in mainstream sources. Much of what one sees in Britain in political discussions and in the mainstream press these days, independently of and connected with, however, to the boycott movement, is a obsession with Israel, with the Middle East, with increasing entry and filtering into the mainstream of discourse certain images that we associate with traditional anti-Semitism, particularly the idea of an all-powerful Jewish conspiracy which manipulates the press. It's often described as the Zionist lobby, sometimes as a Jewish lobby. It's regarded as resident in America, but with an effective branch franchised in Britain, that this group essentially manipulates foreign policy through a variety of unspecified mechanisms, that it suppresses dissent, both in academia and in public discussion. Now, this idea, which is a traditional idea on the fringes of the far left and far right, have always been there. These ideas are in North America. They've been part of the European anti-Semitic tradition for many years, certainly formalized in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, etc., have come to permeate increasingly mainstream public discourse in Britain. And there's a tendency to, amongst commentators, particularly in the Jewish community, to see this as a result of the rise of Islamism, radical Islamic movements in the British Islamic community, which by no means is entirely controlled by these groups, but where these groups have become increasingly vocal, and to see the left as, or parts of the left as sort of impresarios for Islamism, which is the driving force, and therefore you get an idea of Britain as a kind of golden age, Britain, a myth of golden age in which Britain was traditionally tolerant of Jews and as well as other minorities, And what happened is that the last 20 years, or last 10 to 15 years, has seen a kind of rise or legitimization of this kind of vilification of Jews by extension with the, or to the portrayal of Israel as a criminal state, a rogue state, and as therefore the operatives in a conspiracy, criminal conspiracy intended to advance its interests. And that all of this is very new and is foreign to traditional British discourse. And this, while sort of this kind of discourse, this extreme obsession with Israel and almost a kind of mythic portrayal, Manichaean portrayal of the Middle East conflict as a portrayal of good versus evil, rather than a complex conflict between two competing national movements in which there's a great deal of justice on both sides, both the Palestinian and the Israeli side. There's a kind of denaturalization of this conflict, and one can see it, this idea coming right through into the mainstream. That it exists on the fringes is nothing new, impressive, or frightening. It's always there as a kind of dormant virus in the body politic of the West and in the Middle East. But that it has now infiltrated into the very center of public discussion is what ought to give cause for alarm. Let me give you a few examples of how this plays out. In Britain, I don't know to what extent you're aware of this sort of thing. So here are some examples which I think can be multiplied. I'm just going to select them because they're particularly clear, but they're by no means unrepresentative of many things that do go on. By no means do all people believe these kinds of things, but that they go on in mainstream political circles is an indication of where things have headed. So Claire Short was a minister in the Tony Blair's Labour government, certainly a government that was not hostile to Israel by any means. And she served from 1997 to 2003 as Minister of Development. She was on the left of the Labour Party, but by no means one of the more extreme members. She posted a comment on a website called The Skies Are Weeping, which was set up to promote a cantata written for Rachel Corrie, who's the American peace activist killed by an Israeli army bulldozer in Gaza in 2003. And here's her statement. Written, and it's still there if you wish to see it. The article that I'm using as the basis of this talk is posted on the YIISA website, so you can consult it for these references. So here's Claire Short. I'm supporting the world premiere of the cantata for Rachel Corrie because there's been an unusual campaign to silence even a cantata to commemorate a young woman who gave her life in order to stand for justice. I also believe that the U.S. backing for Israeli policies of expansion of the Israeli state and oppression of the Palestinian people is the major cause of bitter division and violence in the world. Best wishes, Claire Short. So in a very succinct way, you have the idea, not that the conflict is brutal or that Israel is misguided in its policies, entirely legitimate points of view, but the idea that in fact Israel and its policies combined with American encouragement is the source of all conflict in America, which is a very different sort of perspective. Now in 2006, the second example, this by a government minister, a former government minister, not some wild-eyed radical handing out leaflets at a university campus. So in 2006, the all-party parliamentary inquiry on anti-Semitism released a report, a very important report. You can download it from the website. I contributed a paper as evidence to it. And the general gist of the report is that there's an alarming increase in anti-Semitic discourse as well as actual physical violence against Jews, where the discourse is actually more worrying than the violence. The violence is still within the domain of incidents, whereas the discourse has become increasingly widespread. And the report, the committee chair was not Jewish, a Labour parliamentarian by the name of Dennis McShane, and there are others. The members of the committee were by and large not Jewish, and they spanned all parties, concluded that there was a serious problem of racism directed at Jews in Britain, a kind of renaissance of respectability for anti-Jewish discourse. The response in the press was extremely interesting amongst academics. So most people, particularly on the left, who had traditionally greeted previous reports on other kinds of racism with great concern, particularly, for example, the McPherson report of '97 on a racist murder of a black teenager, Stephen Lawrence, in '93, greeted such reports as evidence of the need for action, and quite rightly so, dismissed this report as a diversionary attempt to take away attention from the Palestinian problem and suppress dissent, and hence the operation of the Zionist lobby in Parliament. So this was the kind of thing, and these things were said openly on university campuses by leading academics, as well as by commentators in the newspapers, and the quotes are given to you in the paper. I won't go over them because of reasons of the time. Even more frightening than this, in some sense, has become a daily grind, these kinds of reactions, is the casual throwaway lines which public figures who don't have strong high-profile involvement in a Middle East issue or Jewish issues, and are sort of benign figures on those questions, who will now often say things that betray an extraordinary willingness to take as default normative some of the very myths and tropes that we see as central to traditional anti-Semitic demonology. So Richard Dawkins, you may have heard of him, is well known as a professor of genetics and scientific education. He wrote a book called The Selfish Gene, which was an original, provocative, if not entirely uncontroversial view of the way in which evolution works and translated into cultural terms. He's also a professor of public education and science at Oxford, presents himself accurately, I think, as a scientific humanist. He's also a militant atheist who spends most of his time arguing these days that religion is, organized religion is the source of all suffering in human history. Not terribly well documented scholarly study, but that's neither here nor there. Published a book called The God Delusion, which was a bestseller both in Britain and America, and presents himself as a kind of forefront of liberal anti-religious humanism. So he was recently interviewed on his attempt to set up a foundation for promoting atheism in America. He made the following statement in this interview in The Guardian, which is the leading left liberal newspaper in America. He said, when you think about how fantastically successful the Jewish lobby has been, though in fact they are less numerous, I'm told, he's talking about America, religious Jews anyway, than atheists, and yet they more or less monopolize American foreign policy, as far as many people can see. So if atheists could achieve a small fraction of that influence, the world would be a better place. What he's saying here is not intended to be incitement against Jews, simply, as we all know, the Jews run foreign policy in America. There are a small number of people who, through, he doesn't even use the term Zionist, Jewish lobby, run American foreign policy, and if only we could achieve that power, this kind of sympathetic envy of that sort of influence. So here you see a malicious, toxic anti-Semitic myth being perpetuated as a normative assumption that needn't be discussed, and it wasn't the main issue in the review. More surprisingly, it aroused no anger or indignation amongst the readers of the newspaper, but instead endorsement. This is the so-called left, except on the part of a few Jews who are treated as the usual suspects. Okay, so then we have the boycott movement, which in Britain is actually quite unique. So interestingly enough, there are 4 major unions which have passed boycott motions. And in total, combined, they actually represent several 100,000 workers. These are not small unions. One is Unison, which is the Union of Public Service Workers. The other is the Transport General Workers Union. Then there's the College and Universities Union, mine, which I've resigned from twice now. And maybe I had it because of the boycott issue. Then there's the journalists' unions. All passed boycott motions of one description or another. And it's very interesting that no other country has this kind of phenomenon. So there are instances of boycott activity in Europe, in North America, in Canada. CUPE, the Canadian Public Employees, passed a boycott motion which was then very roundly condemned by Buzz Hargrave, who's the dean of the Canadian Labour Movement and the head of the United Auto Workers, which is a progressive left-wing union, condemned it out of hand as an exercise in bigotry. So it has no traction, the boycott movement, even in Europe, where attitudes towards Israel are far more hostile than they are explicitly on the surface than in Britain. But Britain seems to have this as a mainstream phenomenon. Now, the interesting question. Now, it's interesting that the academic union, the Union of Colleges and Universities, recently retreated from its boycott activities because they were advised that to pursue them by their own, they were advised by their legal team to pursue the boycott activity would run them the risk of violating Britain's anti-racist discrimination laws. And the person who advised them on this turns out to be none other than Anthony Lester, who is a very distinguished lawyer and jurist, who was responsible for drafting much of Britain's progressive anti-discrimination legislation from the 1970s, comparable to the landmark anti-discrimination laws that were passed in America in the 60s, and which were used as a model, explicitly used as a model. Now, before his identity was revealed as the author of this advice to discontinue the boycott activity, when the union first announced that it was withdrawing from it, there was a tremendous protest from the boycott supporters within the union, claiming that it was in fact Jewish lawyers and the Zionist conspiracy which had been responsible for this. They named one, Anthony Julius, who in fact had nothing to do with this advice at all. And even after Anthony Lester was revealed as the source of the advice, the letters kept pouring into the newspapers from leading academics, many of them, insisting that in fact this was an example of the suppression of dissent. Now imagine if somebody had advised the union that its course of action it was taking ran the risk of violating anti-discrimination laws because they were threatening to course of action which exclude blacks or Muslims or any other ethnic minority, Catholics, whatever you wish. And there would have been massive embarrassment in the sense that they had crossed the line. But here instead what we had was a defense of the action and an attempt to stigmatize and marginalize the legal advice, which was objective legal advice by one of the authors of progressive legislation that the left itself had applauded, and rightfully so, as a bulwark of defense against racism. Here this so-called anti-racists were attacking the advice as nothing short of the suppression of dissent by the Zionist lobby, in those words. So we have a problem here. We have a serious problem. Now, it's even more interesting to look at the issue of lobbies and dissent, okay, the suppression of dissent, because there have been a whole series of fairly high-profile cases of suppression of dissent, or suppression of free expression of opinion, plus interference in internal affairs in Britain by lobbying groups. But none of them, interestingly enough, have been the so-called Zionist lobby. But they've also failed to attract any attention from the defenders of freedom, who are making the noise here. So, for example, let me give you two particularly prominent examples. In December of 2006, this is not quite recent, the Attorney General of Britain announced the cancellation of a major anti-corruption investigation by the Special Fraud Office of Saudi influence peddling with the British aerospace industry company, BAE, which is the largest manufacturer of military equipment, and particularly military aircraft. Now, the event that they were investigating was a series of kickbacks, alleged kickbacks, in which British arms manufacturers were accused of paying large bribes to Saudi government officials in order to secure contracts. Now, this violates Britain's, aside from being bad in itself, it violates Britain's treaty commitments under the international laws which Britain had signed to eliminate bribery and corruption from international trade. And the OECD sharply criticized the decision of the government not to proceed, but to cancel this investigation. The reason they canceled it was it threatened British-Saudi relations. But this was a clear example of a lobby, a very powerful economic lobby and political lobby, interfering in due process of law in Britain. And yet nobody, and it was widely covered in the British press. People expressed pious sentiments, but there was never upset over the issue of lobbying itself. It never became an issue. Now, here's another case, which is a direct parallel to some of the alleged cases of suppression of dissent in the academic world, except that this one is well documented and actually took place. So in 2006, Cambridge University Press published a book called Alms for Jihad by two American academics, one called Millard Bird and the other called Robert O'Collins, both from the University of California. But it was published in Britain by Cambridge University Press, a very reputable university publisher. Now, the book actually alleged that certain Islamic charities, not all by any means, but certain, were channeling money through to terrorist groups, in particular to Al-Qaeda. In the spring of 2007, a wealthy Saudi businessman, Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz, brought a libel. He was also a banker, who has connections to the royal family, the House of Saud, brought a libel suit against the British courts and CUP because his family was mentioned quite tangentially, incidentally, in these books, claiming the defamation of character. The result was that CUP didn't fight the case. The reason being the British libel laws notoriously favor the plaintiff who brings a complaint. And it's almost impossible to win for a defendant. One of the rare cases where defendants won a libel case in Britain was where the Deborah Lipstadt managed to have David Irving convicted, not convicted, out of his libel case thrown out, and he was saddled with the legal costs which bankrupted him. Very few people realized what an enormous achievement this was in legal terms. Anyway, in order to avoid the cost of an expensive trial under Britain's skewed libel laws, CUP, the Cambridge University Press, settled out of court. How did they settle out of court? They pulped the copies of the books which they had in stock, sent out letters to the libraries all over the world asking them to withdraw those that were in circulation. Only those in Britain were withdrawn. The Americans refused to withdraw their copy. And paid a large undisclosed amount of money. Now you might think this is a one deal event. In fact, there have been numerous cases that Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz has brought against various writers in British courts because they expressed views that he disapproved of. But he's never been required to prove or to substantiate any of his claims of defamation of character, because all of the publishers who he has, or authors he's brought claims against, have settled out of court for fear of being penalized by the British libel laws. Now this would seem to me, naively, to be a fairly clear-cut case of suppression of dissent by powerful economic interests using misguided law. And one would think that people who believe in freedom of speech, even if not necessarily agreeing with views expressed by those who use it, would jump on this as an example of a lobby. But in fact, the heroes of free speech in Britain refused to respond to this, and most of the press refused to report it. I found out about it through an article in the New York Times. Okay, so this is the kind of thing, yet one sees on a daily basis the charge of Zionist suppression of free speech. Well, if the Zionist lobby is suppressing free speech, they're not doing a very good job of it, because the nature of that speech is certainly not going their way, and Mearsheimer and Walt, who have just finished a very successful several-week engagement playing houses all over Britain, at every major campus, were greeted as conquering heroes. So that if there is a Zionist lobby, they should be fired, because they're totally incompetent. Now, the important point here is, where does this idea of, this very traditional idea of Jewish power, exercised through mechanisms never made explicit, but always in the background, this criminal conspiracy manipulating world events, the kind of stuff that fit Tsarist anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitism, fascist attitudes towards Jews, that were traditionally associated with the right, but then became absorbed by Stalin, and mixed with notions of Jews as having their power through capitalism, and et cetera, et cetera. Where does it enter the mainstream of a liberal democracy, in which moderation and respect for human rights have always been defining concerns? Well, we're told by people who look at this that in fact this is new in Britain. It's a new kind of anti-Semitism that has no roots in the past, and that if anything it's the result of the corruption of British society by unfortunate misguided political ideas, many of them attributed to Islamists. I think this is a serious mistake. Islamists certainly exist in Britain, and aside from the issue of violence and terrorism, have played a role in promoting extremist ideas. They certainly are a small minority from the Muslim community, but they also have no power. They do not edit newspapers, mainstream British newspapers. They do not control television stations. They don't run academic presses, and they do not generally have major positions at British universities. They are a fringe group which has been granted a fair amount of attention and misguided legitimization, but they are hardly, and they've also unfortunately persecuted the Muslim community in large measure, and certainly progressive elements within it. But not only do Islamists have very little power, Muslims in Britain as a community, there are several communities, do not have the kind of power required to produce this kind of entry into mainstream consensus that one sees. So this is, I think, a case of misguided deferral or misapplication of the source of where this is coming from. If in fact it is coming from a certain element of the left, it's not because the left is legitimizing Islamism as such, but because the anti-Semitic and racist elements of Islamism resonate with the attitudes of that left as well as other elements. And you see this very clearly in that other elements of Islamist propaganda, for example, anti-gay attitudes, strong anti-Hindu and anti-Indian attitudes, strong anti-feminist views, generally are not picked up and trumpeted but treated as a source of embarrassment. Whereas the anti-Semitism is generally treated as the perhaps misguided but authentic voice of a liberation movement. So if anything, I think that these do reflect the attitudes of the homegrown population rather than of radical groups operating on the fringes of immigrant communities. In order to sort of substantiate that view, I think it's necessary to look, in this case briefly, I've given you a lot more detail in the papers and I'll go into in the talk, some of the defining events of Jewish life in Britain over the past 800 years, because actually something that, although the Jews have been in Britain since the early Middle Ages, and are by no means foreign to Britain, but are integral to British society over a very long period of history, they're constantly treated as immigrants, foreigners, and indelibly alien to British life. And I think that is part of what is surfacing now, which is the attitude that a very mainstream, deeply rooted set of cultural attitudes that run across the political spectrum, left, right, and center, according to which Jews as a collectivity are essentially illegitimate. And that their legitimacy consists primarily in their invisibility, that as individuals they can be granted entry into British society gradually through induction into an elite, but that their acceptability is conditional upon their suppression of the full dimensions of their Jewish identity and their willingness to detach themselves and ideally to reject any notion of ethnic, national dimension to their life. This might sound strange to an American audience in which multiculturalism and ethnic diversity are built into the fabric of society, but it is in fact an integral feature of Jewish life in Britain. Now let me give you some sort of high points of, or sort of main points of reference to British Jewish history, which I think will indicate the kind of factors that are at play, and which we're seeing surface perhaps in packaging these days. Organized life in Britain for Jews began with the Norman invasion in 1066, although there may well have been Jews prior to that. Living in the country, that is, Jews came along with the Norman invasion and established themselves as a community in the period of that invasion, which started in 1066. In their first century in the country, they established a community based in London, but in other parts of the country they also created a presence. They were largely involved in financial activities, some commerce, but largely money lending, and this is due to the fact that they were coming from Ashkenazic lands, primarily France and Germany, where they and continued to be banned from other kinds of activities. They were banned from the craft guilds, from owning land, etc., in Britain as they were in these other countries. Now, their role as financial entrepreneurs, sources of capital, gave them a special role. They, in fact, there was a special branch of the Treasury called the Jewish Exchequer, whose job it was to raise taxes from Jews. This money was used to finance royal activities, military campaigns, and building activities, and they were subject to special levies. And initially, they achieved a fair degree of prosperity. However, under Henry III, Henry III decided to impose upon them particularly heavy levies called tallages to finance a whole set of both military campaigns and building projects, and they increased due to the large debt. This resulted in the bankrupting of the community, which left it highly exposed to royal disinterest. They enjoyed royal protection to the extent that they were a source of revenue. On the other hand, they also were found themselves in a position of being extremely unpopular amongst the people to whom they were lending money, and they were often given jobs of tax collection. This is an old medieval configuration which we know well from a whole variety of European countries. So by the time Edward I, who was responsible for the expulsion, came to the throne, they had lost their usefulness under which they had enjoyed royal protection for several hundred years, and they were simply expelled en masse. Between that period, there was a large, Britain actually led the Western world in Europe in the anti-Semitic violence. So the Jewish community was very small at the time of the expulsion. It was estimated by around 16,000, and that's considered high. They were definitely influential. Also, the population of Britain, or England, where they lived, in England primarily, was not large. So the first recorded instance of a blood libel in 1144 took place in Britain, where Jews were accused of ritual murder of William of Norwich during the Passover period. This charge gained momentum and climaxed later in 1255 with another blood libel trial. There was violence associated with each of these incidents. Then the large-scale violence that one sees in the medieval period began with the coronation of Richard I, where Jews attempted to present gifts at his coronation at Westminster Abbey. They were prevented from entering the palace. In fact, their attempt to participate in the coronation, no doubt to secure a better position for themselves with the new monarch, resulted in pogroms throughout London, which spread to York and various other communities. There was a famous pogrom in York in which several hundred people, 150 to be exact, were killed. This was in 1190. And this then sparked off 100 years of rioting, measures of partial exclusions from a variety of Jewish counties, a variety of British counties. And as a result, in 1290, by the time they were bankrupt, they were simply thrown out in mass. So Britain was the first country to expel its Jews globally in a mass expulsion, 200 years before the Spanish expulsion, and over 200 years before the Spanish expulsion and the Portuguese expulsion. The interesting thing about this is that it's rarely discussed. Okay, so if you look at documentaries and pageants, the medieval life in Britain is venerated as the time in which the major cultural institutions and political institutions of the country were established. And there's a great deal of fascination with it. The situation of Jews in Britain was never discussed. People know the facts. However, this kind of systematic persecution, and it extends farther than just the expulsion. Prior to the expulsion and prior to the partial bans, Britain was the first country to force Jews to wear special clothing, yellow badges, this kind of thing. This kind of role is simply edited and airbrushed right out of the presentation of the Middle Ages. You'll read about Edward I, you won't read about the expulsion. You read about Henry III, you won't read about the Tolliges, and on and on and on. By contrast, everybody in Britain knows about the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and this is treated as a European catastrophe, not less than a Jewish catastrophe, so in the sense that they did it. Whereas their own role is simply not acknowledged, even though the facts are entirely accessible. They've never been suppressed, and they were well researched, amongst others by Jewish historians of the classic variety like Cecil Roth. Okay, now, officially Jews then were banned for 400 years, and there was actual legislation preventing them from entering the country. However, there were communities throughout this 400-year period of Jews living as Marranos, that is crypto-Jews, or they're called new Christians, who had protected themselves fleeing the Inquisition by hiding behind forced baptisms. And they lived there and established themselves as reasonably successful commercial communities with trading connections, and they were based in London, particularly in the 16th and 17th century. However, what's not known is that they lived in a very precarious situation that, should they be discovered, they would be thrown out of the country. The extent to which that this is the case is shown that there was a second expulsion not generally known about in 1609, when there was a fight within the Portuguese Marrano community in London, and one group denounced the other as Jews to further their business interests, and the entire Portuguese community was thrown out. So there was actually a second expulsion as late as 1609. It was exactly in this period, incidentally, actually 20 years before, that Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice and the Jew of Malta were written. Okay, so these are generally, when discussed in the context of literary anti-Semitism, the sort of established wisdom of the luminaries from Oxford, Cambridge, and other places is to assure us that this was just not really intended to be anti-Semitism. These were the cultural attitudes of Europe. But in fact, these attitudes were alive and well in the popular imagination of Renaissance Britain. And one sees that they had actual serious implications for public policy in this expulsion in 1609. They were not abstract ideas. The popular imagination reflected public policy. Now, we come to the Cromwell period. So in general, I don't know how much you know about Cromwell readmission, which was celebrated in 2006, but the popular view, which was on wide display last year, which the Jews trumpeted along with everyone else, was that Cromwell actually readmitted the Jews as a result of a petition from a Dutch Sephardi rabbi by the name of Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, who in 1655 requested that the exclusion of Jews be reversed. There had been the Puritan Revolution. This had resulted in a radical form of Protestantism with strong attachment to the New Testament and Hebraism, and it was thought, well, now's a good time to bring them back. There's more positive attitudes, and that Cromwell graciously invited Jews back, and from then on it's been a slow but steady progress up an inclined plane towards integration, and that's when modern Jewish history started. In fact, this is largely mythic. There was never an invitation or acceptance of a request for Jews to return. It's true in 1655, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel came to London with a pamphlet outlining his proposal for the return of the Jews. There were a number of reasons why he did this. I won't go into them now. Cromwell, in fact, was interested in facilitating this petition, the reason being that the economy was not in good shape. The Jewish community in Amsterdam was was more or less full up with Spanish and Portuguese refugees from the Inquisition who were living openly as Jews. Holland, Amsterdam in particular, was the most liberal center in Europe. Jews could live openly. These people enjoyed international trading connections with the Orient and the Middle East because a lot of the Sephardic Jews had gone to the Balkans, and this was a golden opportunity for Britain to displace Amsterdam as a center for a variety of trade and commercial activities. Cromwell presented the proposal to the Council of State, which was ruling in Parliament, and they wouldn't pass it. The reason they wouldn't pass it is there was a lot of opposition of two kinds: traditional religious opposition, including Protestants, and economic opposition from merchants and traders in London who didn't want the competition. So, in fact, the Council of State never approved the readmission of Jews. So how did they get back? Well, actually, after the expulsion in 1609, the Jews drifted back as Marranos throughout the 17th century. By 1655, there was a substantial Spanish-Portuguese Marrano community in London. Now, in 1655, Spain was at war with Britain, and the Spanish community was exposed not as Jews but as Spaniards, suspected of possible collaboration with the Spanish crown. The result was that, again, due to a business dispute, one of the prominent leaders of the Portuguese Marrano community, a guy by the name of Robles, was denounced. Antonio Rodriguez Robles, who was a Marrano merchant, denounced by one of his business rivals as a Spanish agent, and all his property was confiscated. And his defense was very original. He said, "You've got it wrong. I'm not Spanish. I'm a Portuguese Jew fleeing the Inquisition. Please give me back my property." And in fact, his property was returned to him by the Council of State because it was decided that a Portuguese Jew was less threatening than a Spanish agent. This provided a legal precedent for Jews to live openly, and a section of the Marrano community emerged out of the closet and established the first legal synagogue in Creechurch Lane in London, and this was the re-establishment of the Jewish community as a matter of individual precedent. This was a precedent purely based on that individual case, and there's much else in Britain that had no wider constitutional significance. However, it was used by the Jews to build up their position. Now, as soon as Cromwell died and his son took over, and certainly when Charles II came back in the Restoration, there was a large reaction against Jewish presence, so that in fact they attempted to block further immigration because small numbers of Jews were then coming from Amsterdam to take advantage of the newly legalized presence of the Jewish community. Charles II, fortunately being a pragmatist and a bon vivant, had no interest in this, and simply discarded their petitions. And again, in traditional British fashion, it was essentially a right established by precedent rather than by legislation. The attempt to get legislation to legalize the Jewish presence had failed, but they were allowed to build up a community in small, inconspicuous fashion through precedent. Now, throughout the 17th and early 18th century, the community developed and prospered and enjoyed a certain degree, a fair amount of peace and success, operating within the limits of low-profile, minimal visibility. However, again, we see that when attempts were made to withdraw some of the fairly strict legal constraints on Jewish integration into the economic and political life of the country, the traditional anti-Jewish prejudice very quickly surfaced into pretty virulent opposition and near violence. So again, it's not generally known, the Jewish Naturalization Bill of 1753. So Jews who were not born in Britain were considered aliens like other people, whereas non-Jews who were aliens could become naturalized, the same way people here can become naturalized. Jews could not, because the naturalization process required baptism. Now, some Jews, of course, converted to get around this, but those who didn't could go through a very expensive process called endonization, which brought you partial rights, but not full rights, couldn't inherit property, and it wasn't clear that you could own land. So a bill was introduced by a number of people for a variety of reasons to cancel this and to allow for Jewish naturalizations. The official title was called the Jewish Naturalization Bill, became known historically as the Jew Bill of 1753, and it passed both houses of Parliament with war support. This touched off a massive counter-reaction of violent opposition in which the press and political circles and the church, various religious groups, campaigned against the bill, arguing that it indicated a weakness in British public policy, that the country was now open to domination by foreign Jewish conspiracies and economic interests. The result was that the opposition, which was explicitly racist, was so vociferous that the bill was withdrawn and repealed in 1753. Okay, this was a kind of pattern that we see repeating itself time and time again. So there were pogroms in Poland and Ukraine in 1768, right, in the period post-Khmelnytsky, and there were really serious pogroms. And this brought one of the first large influxes of East European Jewry to Britain. And interestingly enough, because it was an impoverished immigration who came between 1771 and 1774, they were an embarrassment to the Jewish community. There was crime, social problems, etc., as well as a problem for the London authorities. And one sees the beginning of restrictions on Jewish immigration, with the mayor of London, for example, the Lord Mayor of London offering free passage to Jewish immigrants who were willing to return, go back to Poland and the Ukraine. And the response of the Jewish community was to endorse this policy because this immigration is considered an embarrassment. So what you see then is a general pattern of Jewish presence being tolerated by precedent, attempts to expand the domain of Jewish rights by official legal procedures encountering a lot of opposition, and a Jewish community that enjoys extremely limited conditional acceptance and living in constant fear of being expelled or subjected to a disadvantage, and often then, in the interest of protecting their limited presence, choosing to collaborate, or at least cooperate with government policies which were restrictive on things like immigration or Jewish laws, Jewish rights. A similar kind of thing can be seen in the campaign for Jewish emancipation, if you can call it a campaign. So until there's a kind of myth that in 1858 Jews achieved political emancipation by an act of parliament, and this is not true. What happened was that until 1858 Jews could not sit in either house of parliament because, as Jews, because they were, a condition for membership in the House of Commons was a member of Parliament had to take a Christian oath. And if they weren't prepared to do it, they didn't get their seats. They could be elected, but they wouldn't be seated. Now, there were between 1830 and 1857, there were 13 bills that were proposed called Jewish disability bills, which were intended to lift these restrictions. And all of them were blocked, 2 in the House of Commons and the rest in the House of Lords. They were consistently turned back. And eventually, the way in which Jews were allowed to enter the House of Commons was that Lionel Rothschild, who'd been elected 3 times on 3 separate occasions and not allowed to take his seat because he wouldn't take the oath, finally was permitted in 1858 by an arrangement that Disraeli made with the House of Lords in the face of considerable opposition, which allowed each house to determine their own conditions of membership. And as a result of this, the House of Commons then permitted Rothschild to determine his own oath, and he was seated after 11 years of attempting to take his seat. So there was no period of emancipation. That was, again, a case of an individual precedent. It expired when the parliament that he sat in expired. In fact, what happened was then later, a bill was passed to regularize this arrangement, and eventually, it wasn't until 1866 that Jews were then allowed into both houses of parliament. But again, you see the pattern of an individual precedent being set and used to expand rights of Jews. Even more interesting was the fact that there was no large campaign for Jewish emancipation. You might say, well, that's the way things are done in Britain. Individual precedents are established, rights are expanded for communities, but that's actually not true. So it's interesting to contrast the Jewish emancipation process in Britain with that of other groups. So, for example, the Catholic Association agitated through large mass protests with a lot of non-Catholic support for the passage of the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which removed most of the political disabilities or constraints on Catholic participation in the political and public life of the country. The abolitionist movement, which was a massive cause of progressive opinion in Britain, and with heavy participation of the church and various religious groups, resulted in the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and of slavery itself in 1833. The huge suffragette movement with very large-scale support in different sectors of the social strata resulted in the passage of women's enfranchisement in 1918 for women over 30 and for women over 28 in, no, it was 1918?
Yeah, pretty late.
Yeah, indeed. And in 1928. And similarly, you have the Chartists at the beginning of the 19th century establishing the foundations of the British labor movement and the union movement. They were established in 1838, and a century or more of struggle for collective bargaining and workers' rights. These were all mass social movements of progressive Britain that involved huge debates in the press, etc. Nothing of the sort happened with respect to Jewish rights. One could say it was a smaller community, but it was not that small. And these were issues that did engage intellectuals. There were some speeches by people like Macaulay in Parliament, George Babbage Macaulay, who delivered a very fine speech in 1833 on Jewish disabilities, but these were very much the exceptions. Even more interesting was the fact that the Jewish community was by and large not particularly in favor of a large campaign. They viewed the whole issue of the emancipation with a great deal of ambiguity. The precursor of the Board of Deputies, which is like the Jewish Federation, or the main elected representatives of the Jewish community, these groups were extremely uneasy about public campaigning. They generally relied upon what could be called Stadlanut politics, translated as sort of elitist politics, where representatives, wealthy representatives of the Jewish community, used their positions of influence with counterpart members in the economic and political elite of Britain to secure dispensations for individual Jewish cases, which then established the precedent. That's the way to do it. Let's go on now to more contemporary instances of this kind of behavior. So, large-scale Jewish immigration to Britain started in 1880 from Eastern Europe, when you had, again, in response to pogroms in the Ukraine and Russia, well, the Ukraine, because Jews were not living in Russia at the time, they were in the Pale of Settlements, plus anti-Jewish activity by East European governments like Romania. You had a large-scale immigration to Britain, which is when the bulk of the Jewish community really entered the country. It moved in size from 65,000 in 1880 to 300,000 in 1914, with 200,000 concentrated in London, and that's more or less its demographics today, essentially. It peaked at 500,000 in the 50s, but what you see today are exactly these numbers. The Jews who came in this period, as anticipated at in the period of the middle of the 18th century, were largely impoverished East European Jews, who established their main centers at the East End of London, which was sort of like the Lower East Side in New York was to Jewish immigration in America. Very quickly on, about the presence of the large numbers of Jewish immigrants provoked enormous amount of hostility and opposition. Much of it explicitly anti-Semitic, some of it coded in the form of anti-alien xenophobia. Most of the immigrants coming at that time were Jewish. This resulted in the passage of a whole sequence of anti-alien restrictions from 1905 through the First World War, which effectively cut off all Jewish immigration completely. To give you a sense of the extent to which it was directed at Jews, let me quote from Balfour. Arthur Balfour, Prime Minister, Britain, the same one who gave us the Balfour Declaration, which reached fruition in the partition of Palestine. Today is the anniversary of that day. The same Balfour stated in the debate in 1905 over the first aliens restriction, which was an anti-immigrant bill, said the following: "It would not be to the advantage of the civilization of the country that there should be an immense body of persons who, however patriotic, able, and industrious, however much they threw themselves into national life, still by their own action remained a people apart and not merely held a religion differing from the vast majority of their fellow countrymen, but only intermarried among themselves." So this is clearly a very targeted kind of attitude, and Balfour represented a large component of opinion of the Conservative Party, and this was policy. So there was also a conservative politician who became Home Secretary in the 20s. His name was William Johnson Hicks. His career was studied in a publication by David Cicirani, who's coming to talk to you next semester, who made it his policy to enforce discriminatory immigration standards when he was Home Secretary, making sure that East European Jews were barred. So by the time the 30s came around, and the crisis in European Jewry emerged, first in Germany, then in Austria, then in Poland, and Czechoslovakia and Poland, due to the rise of Nazism, there was no need to introduce anti-immigrant legislation to keep Jews out. That legislation existed, and it was applied. In fact, it was not simply the conservative government that supported it. The TUC, the Trade Union Congress, and most of the union movement actively supported, from 1905 on, the exclusion of Jewish immigrants. They regarded them as an undesirable element, largely for reasons of economic competition. They didn't want cheap labor. There were parallel developments in America. However, immigration in America wasn't actually cut off until 24, and the result of the motivation for that was a more generalized xenophobia, and here it was clearly targeted. During the 30s, in the period of large-scale emergence of a large-scale refugee problem, first from German Jews, and then successively Austrian, Czech, and Polish Jews, Britain followed a policy of continuing to apply its existing immigration controls to keep out as many Jews as they could. The reason being that they argued that the country couldn't support them economically. Now, in fact, those refugees who did enter were generally supported by the Jewish community. There was an official agreement between the Jewish community and the British government for German Jews that the Jewish community would cover the costs of absorbing all of these immigrants. That agreement lapsed with in 38 with the Anschluss, in which Austria was conquered by the Nazis. The Jewish community said could no longer afford it. What you saw time and time again, what you saw time and time again in the statements of government ministers as well as labor people from the TUC was a great deal of sympathy for the victims of Nazism. There was certainly no lack of support and sympathy for Jews facing Nazi persecution, and an unwillingness to allow them to enter Britain because of a generalized sense that they were a community that couldn't be easily absorbed, and that should they be absorbed, there would be a rise in anti-Semitism. This is a theme that constantly comes up in statements by British officials, particularly in the Home Office and in the Foreign Office, that should immigration go beyond certain levels, that there will certainly be anti-Semitism because Jews are simply not easily assimilable. There's a great deal of detail here that's worth discussing, but I'm going to pass over it. What is worth saying is that Britain was in no way unique in its response to Jewish immigration and desperate plight of Jewish refugees in the period of the 30s and during the Second World War. Most Western democracies behaved in exactly the same way, or worse. Canada's history, in fact, was notable for being perhaps the worst of all Western democracies. The United States was somewhat more generous, but continued to co-manage with Britain a policy of deflecting the immigrant policy, the immigrant crisis by making statements that making sure that immigrants were not helped. However, we began to see a very major diversion between American and British policy in 1944 with the establishment of the War Refugee Board under Morgenthau, who was at the time Secretary of the Treasury, and the beginning of American proactive measures to try and help survivors behind enemy lines, and the British opposing these actions on the grounds that they were interfering with the economic boycott of these countries. The real difference, however, emerges in the post-war period. So in the post-war period, you see from 45 to 48 progressive liberalization of American immigration under Truman and the admission of large numbers of Jews from the DP camps in proportion to their numbers in those camps into the States, whereas in Britain what you see is in fact a determination not to allow them in. And this was under a Labour government with Bevan as the foreign minister, declaring that in fact the Jewish problem, the refugee problem, had to be solved by repatriating European Jews neither in Palestine nor in Britain, but they should be sent back to where they came from, which meant Poland and Ukraine, etc. In Poland, there were post-war pogroms going on, which the British were very well aware of, and this did not affect their policies. And you see this very clearly. So, in the post-war period, Britain actually had a severe labor shortage. So, unlike the 30s, there was no labor surplus due to a depression. There was a labor shortage. And in this period, 365,000 non-Jewish immigrants were allowed into the country, and 600,000 alien work permits were issued to recruit foreign workers, many from the same DP camps that the Jews were in. But the Jews were explicitly barred from participating in those programs. In many cases, the foreign workers who were brought in were not carefully screened, and not a small number of Nazi war criminals entered the country. By contrast, a token program was set up to allow in Jewish survivors on grounds of family reunification. The number was kept below 5,000. So it's not only that they were banned from Palestine due to air pressure, they were also explicitly not wanted in Britain, and every effort was made to minimize the number who did get in. The statements are very clear. Now, how does this affect the topics that I've been dealing with now? Well, the way it affects this is that what you see here is a consistent history where the Jews were regarded as an alien element in Britain. So now these were attitudes that were common, I think, to Britain and the rest of Europe. But in fact, whereas in the rest of Europe, particularly in the post-Holocaust era, there's an acknowledgement of the catastrophe of Jewish life in Europe. In Britain, there's a systematic misrepresentation of the nature of British treatment of Jews throughout the history of Jewish presence in Britain. Unfortunately, the Jewish community has, in no small measure, cooperated with this as a means of sustaining its own position in an environment in which they enjoy a highly conditional acceptance. One sees also, with itself included, an interesting bridge between this kind of very traditional hostility towards Jews as a collectivity, not necessarily as individuals, and so-called progressive post-colonialist left-wing ideas that are shaping much of the debate on the Israel-Palestine conflict. You see it very clearly in the work of British historian Toynbee. So Toynbee tells us is that Israeli colonialism is not a left-winger. Was that Israeli colonialism was perhaps the worst in the modern era. on a par with America. Interestingly enough, Britain is not mentioned. Britain is considered exempt from this criticism. So the Americans and the Israelis are the worst colonialists, with Israel winning the competition because their colonialism is an anachronism which extended into the modern world. On the other hand, what you see is in the following statement, which really shows what's behind it. So what the objection to Israel as a country, certainly much criticized in Israel and its policies, the present occupation of the Palestinian territories, etc. But that's not really what was exercising Toynbee, who was writing in the 60s and the 50s and 60s. What really exercised him was the idea of Jewish particularism, the existence of the Jews as a collectivity. So he has this to say. This is a great spiritual treasure, talking about Jewish culture and the Jewish religious tradition. This is a great spiritual treasure which the Jews have to give to all peoples. But one cannot give a treasure and at the same time keep it to oneself. That the giving of this treasure is the Jews' mission, as it surely is, and this mission requires them now at last to make that their paramount aim in place of the incomparable aim that they've always put first so far, ever since their experience of the Babylon captivity. They'll have to give up the national form of the Jewish community's distinctive identity in order to become, without reservation, the missionaries of the universal church that will be open on an equal footing to anyone, Jew or Gentile, who gives his allegiance to Deutero, Isaiah's God, and seeks to do his will. In our time, the Zionist movement has been traveling in just the opposite direction to this. It has not only clung to and accentuated the national form of Jewish communal life, it has also put us back on a territorial basis. The Jewish religion is meant for all mankind, so far from its being unthinkable about the chosen people, it cannot fulfill its destiny of becoming a universal religion unless and until the Jews renounce the national form of their distinctive community identity for the sake of their universal religious mission. It's a fairly classic form of European Christian anti-Semitism, which sees the Jews as an anomaly and an illicit people, and ties it directly to Zionism in Israel. Now, you might say, well, what does this have to do with what's going on now? Well, the deliberate misrepresentation in the popular imagination of British attitudes towards Jews throughout history, I think, has played a major role in allowing people to say things which they might not otherwise have said, had they been perhaps constrained by a conscious recognition of their own history. So recently, in the context of the boycott debate, the Deputy Secretary of the Transport General Workers Union, a man named Barry Comey, in June stated that he would not listen to objections to the union's boycott decision because, in fact, Britain had liberated and saved Jews before, during, and after the Second World War. The statement is a mockery of the facts, but it's particularly ironic that he made the statement in his present position, given that his predecessor, who was the Secretary General of his union, was none other than Bevan, who throughout the 30s campaigned to support government immigration policies, keeping Jewish refugees from Europe, fleeing the Nazis out of Britain, and who after the war, as Foreign Secretary, made sure that they could not get into Britain either. So it's this kind of deliberate blindness to a historical past, rather than the attitudes themselves, which I think play a particular role in shaping public discourse in Britain. If one is convinced then that one has been extremely generous, liberal, forthcoming, progressive, and tolerant, then of course one allows oneself all sorts of freedom of expression in entertaining explicitly racist and misguided notions, which perhaps Europeans whose attitudes are not substantially different will not allow themselves, given the kind of past which has been explicitly acknowledged on the continent.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to say, I guess as somebody who's been in the United Kingdom, studied and worked in the United Kingdom, that I'm not sure if you're quite aware of, I think, the importance of your paper to give a deep historical analysis of the context of anti-Semitism and how it impacts on the contemporary context is really important. And I was reminded as you were going through this whole historical analysis of Melanie Phillips when she was with The Guardian in the late 1980s, and I was a student at Oxford, and she wrote that if you have dinner parties, and dinner conversation, you speak about issues of racism and exclusion over housing and the employment sector, it makes wonderful dinner conversation. Nothing will change, but people, intellectuals, will discuss it. But speak about anti-Semitism, and people will look at the ground, and there'll be silence. And it was something that you can feel. It's something that was almost, as you were saying last night, impolite to discuss. I think this analysis is even more extraordinarily important. So thank you. So, question.
So, let's assume that I came from Mars. And you convinced me that the Brits are defending themselves against some kind of horrible threat called the Jews. I still don't understand what is the danger that the Jews are bringing with them. To whom? To Britain. Become such a very important target to be in the focus of this treatment, to be scrutinized in such a way through history. Can maybe
Good. First of all, from your accent, it sounds like you don't come from North, but from where I come from, but that's another matter. You are asking the question that I ask myself on a daily basis. Why are we, let's assume everything they say is right about the Middle East. And not all of it is wrong. I didn't bring this up in the conversation because I was not talking about the Middle East, but about Jews in Britain and how the Middle East is playing out in the context of that issue. I am not a supporter of Israeli government policy. I've long been a critic. Very much on the left of the Israeli political spectrum. I'm highly critical of Israeli government policy. This was a country like any other country. And what one is seeing, therefore, is not criticism of government policy, but a demonization or trading in mythic demonology, which has little to do with the facts of the Middle East. Right? Darfur is not a serious issue for the British press, in the same way that the Balkan Wars, although covered in the press, didn't generate outrage. So why is it that there is this obsession with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that then spills over into demonology? Yes, many legitimate criticisms of Israel are raised. And that's the problem that's going on here, is it's hard to disentangle the legitimate criticisms, which are well taken and should be pursued with vigor, from the bizarre demonology that slips into, so easily, conspiracy theory and the myth of Jewish power and Jewish malevolence and criminality, bringing us back to the image of the Jew of Malta and the merchant of Venice, which seems to run through the culture and the popular imagination continually and inform these discussions. Why is it? And I don't have a clear answer for that. Why should Britain or the rest of Europe be obsessed with the Middle East to the exclusion, the near exclusion of most other issues, including Iraq, which is, of course, constantly brought up as a disaster, generally attributed to the United States. Their own role in Iraq is seriously downplayed. Why is it that other kinds of disasters where the casualty figures are higher, where the human rights violations are higher, where more people are killed and suffering, not exercising these people in the same way? Well, because there's something, that's to me the indicator that something irrational is happening. That what's going on is really not a debate about the Middle East as such, but the use of the Middle East to leverage an internal discourse, which is being driven by factors that are coming from within traditional British historical concerns. And in this sense, I mean, the conclusions that I'm suggesting tentatively are that, in fact, we're seeing very traditional British attitudes played out in a new packaging. That somehow what really bothers them about Israel is not so much what it does, which in many cases is highly objectionable, but more so than what Britain has done, say in Northern Ireland, more so what Australia did, or more so than what other countries are doing. It seems to me what bothers them that Israel is to them a challenge precisely because it is the most radical affirmation and embodiment of Jewish collectivity, which is what they are not able to deal with. Jews are fine in what amounts to an Albini status, if they are not visible, or if their visibility consists in a kind of diffident, decollectivized, denationalized form, which can be treated as trackable. And this they, I think, share with the rest of Europe. The main difference is the rest of Europe went through the occupation and the Holocaust by and large. And there are constraints that are externally imposed on what people will say. And you see this even in France or in Spain. The people will not say certain things. They will not engage in a boycott because they know what boycotts mean when Jews are on the receiving end. They will not engage in certain kinds of tropes. Because this is not to say that their attitudes are more moderate. In many cases, they're more extreme. The kind of real blood-curdling anti-Semitism lives on in many places there. But these constraints operate because their history is increasingly not misrepresented Whereas in Britain it has. In Britain, I think there's mythology about what British history concerning Jews has been and is today. And that this is what protects them from dealing with the attitudes that continue to inform these discussions, and allows them to say things which otherwise they wouldn't say.
As a Jew who left Germany in 41, late 41, lived through all the 30s and Christmas and so on, I had the impression that when the chips were down after November 38, the only place where people who left the concentration camps who had to leave was open was England. The permits were issued quite readily, and also there were the kinder transports, which were in. So I'm wondering how that fits into your story. Is that an exception?
They did. I mean, Britain took a total of 80,000 Jews. They didn't block all Jews. There were extraordinary examples of generosity, but this was done within the framework of existing restrictions on immigration. Officially, the policy was Jews could come in only to the extent that they could satisfy the requirements of the immigration restrictions meant they had to show themselves not to be useful to the British economy and to be liable to British interests. Now, in fact, it's not the case that large numbers were taken. 70 to 80,000 were taken. Those were taken, almost all of them were granted temporary residence. The kinder transport was 9 to 10,000 kids. The interesting thing about the kinder transport, which was a very important, generous act of decency in a very dark time, 1938, 10,000 Jewish children were brought from Germany and Austria by train. The interesting thing to point out there is that their parents were not allowed in. Now, why were their parents not allowed in? Because of immigration restrictions on the British side. The Germans were desperate to get rid of them. So here, 10,000 kids were turned into orphans because of British restrictions, not because of German restrictions. The permits that were issued in very limited numbers. And there was a general hierarchy. Germans were preferred to Austrians, Austrians were preferred to Czechs, and Czechs were preferred to Poles. There was a strong preference for political refugees of any kind, Jewish or non-Jew. There was a general unwillingness to accept refugees who were called racial or economic refugees, which included most of the Jews who were fleeing the Nazis, who couldn't show that they had been persecuted for political reasons. And in fact, it's simply not the case that large numbers were taken. Now, moreover, after the war, the treatment of many of the refugees was really quite shameful. First of all, during the war, there was a constant effort to repatriate them, to get them out of Britain into other places. So 10,000 were actually re-emigrated out of Britain during the war. 10 to 20,000. So 60,000 remained after the war. And they were still on temporary residence, unlike the States where they were immigrants. 250,000. They were on temporary residence. Many of the restrictions on their work activities, which were imposed by the States, were illegal. They were shown to be illegal, of course, but the authorities made sure not to tell the Jewish refugees until 46, 47. And this included people who fought in the army or people who had assisted the war effort in a variety of activities. The idea was that as many as possible should be forced in power. When they were finally regularized, it was in 1948, 3 years after the end of the war, it was very questionable. The idea was that we don't want that many. The more we have it, the more anti-Semitism is going to be. This is not Nazi-style racism, but the idea that the Jews in large numbers ought not to come. There were big fights with the Americans towards the end of the war, precisely over the issue of what to do with things like the Horthy offer. Right? When Hungary, under Admiral Horthy, offered to let all the Jews, or many of the Jews, who had left in Budapest and in Hungary, go, those who had not been evacuated by the Nazis. Right? And then the Americans were pressing for immediate acceptance of the offer. Whether they would have taken them, there's another question. They may not have. But this was the summer of 44. And the British would spend 3 weeks saying, yes, in principle we agree, but we're worried about being swamped by large numbers of refugees. And a similar situation happened in Romania. So there was this constant theme as we can't take too many. We can take a limited number, yes, and there were many instances of kind of heroic generosity on the part of individual officials, and there was a great deal of sympathy for Jews as being persecuted by Nazis. There was not a willingness to accept any large numbers. Okay. And this persisted long after the war. That is the point. It was after America that had essentially opened its doors. That's the difference. Not that Britain was somehow unique in keeping out refugees. It wasn't. And you're right. It was far more generous in Canada.
More generous than the U.S. in 39.
No. Well, yes, you're right, because of the St. Louis. Yeah, 39, that's true. I think that's correct.
Thank you very much. A brilliant description of what's going on in England.
Everyone, my countrymen.
Just a couple of things I wanted to ask how you would fit them into the picture. And one is something which rather puzzles me, the phenomenon, albeit a limited one, of Holocaust Memorial Day. Why is this being taken on board by the British establishment? What is actually being stated when January 25th, Liberation of Auschwitz Day, is taken on board as a British public event? In practice, one notices that not that much is done. What is done is done in schools, and mainly masterminded by the Holocaust Education Trust, which is a bunch of well-meaning people, many of them other anti-racist groups and so on. But still, it is there, and it's on the calendar. It also, of course, there have been problems with Islamic groups, and not even very extreme Islamic groups, who won't participate, but nonetheless, it sticks, so that interests me very much. And my other question was about the role of British Jews in feeding the extreme anti-Zionist singling out of Israel process, and that has something to do with their consciousness as British, as being British, I think, and what that entails. I think it could be fitted into your narrative, but I wonder how you would do that.
Okay, let me ask the first question about Holocaust Memorial Day. So people who don't know this, Britain has an official Holocaust Memorial Day. It's January something or other?
27th.
January, right. And that was established under Tony Blair, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Right, under the Tony Blair government. It's official. The Holocaust Education Trust, which you also refer to, is an organization which is not Jewish, by the way, which has done a lot of work promoting Holocaust education. There was at one time on the internet a claim that the Holocaust was no longer taught because of objections people telling one Muslim student. It's not true. There's a great deal of Holocaust education in British schools. It's certainly the case. Holocaust education came in quite late in Britain compared to many other countries, but it has always remained basically controversial. And the reason it's controversial is not people don't want to acknowledge the Holocaust as such, but they object, many people object, particularly the Muslim groups that you refer to the idea that a particularistic recognition of the Jewish Holocaust should be given national recognition to the exclusion of others. So which ones? Because in fact, Holocaust Memorial Day does in fact recognize others, the Armenians are mentioned, etc. So they say, well, what about al-Nakba? So many Muslim groups say, what about al-Nakba, which is the disaster of 48 as they describe it, in which Palestinian refugees, 800,000 were expelled from their homes in Palestine, Israel. So there's a great deal of ambivalence about Holocaust, both amongst Jews and non-Jews. Most Jews are